Hearing is the last sense to shut down in a dying human brain. Not sight, not touch, hearing. We assume the body fails all at once, a single switch flipping to off. The research says otherwise. Consciousness doesn't end in one moment, it ends in stages, and the ears are the last door still open. Even now, with brain scanners strapped to the heads of dying patients, scientists can't tell you exactly what a person hears in their final minutes, or whether hearing is even the right word for what's happening. Start with the mechanism. The auditory cortex sits deep in the temporal lobe, wired directly into the brainstem, the most primitive, most stubborn part of the brain. It's the last structure standing when everything else begins to fail. Blood pressure drops, kidneys stop filtering, the hands go cold as circulation retreats toward the core. But the brainstem holds on, and so does the pathway that turns vibration into sound. Doctors have known this for decades, mostly from anecdote. Now they have data. In 2020, a research team at the University of British Columbia, led by neuroscientist Elizabeth Blundon and palliative care physician Romayne Gallagher, ran EEG recordings on hospice patients in their final hours. They played a mix of musical tones and irregular, oddball sounds through headphones, the same test used on healthy, awake volunteers to measure auditory processing. Some of the dying patients, unresponsive to touch and voice, showed brainwave patterns nearly identical to the healthy control group. Their brains were still discriminating one sound from another. Nobody could confirm they were conscious of it. The machines just kept saying, "Something in here is still listening." That's where the concept of the auditory limbic loop comes in. Sound doesn't just register in the cortex, it routes straight through the amygdala and hippocampus, the brain's centers for emotion and memory, before conscious processing even finishes. It's why a song can gut you before you know why. Researchers think this loop may stay active longer than any other sensory pathway because it's older, evolutionarily, built for detecting danger and kin in the dark, long before eyes were any use for that. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the emotional wiring outlives the conscious wiring, is the dying brain still feeling something with no way to signal it back out? Rewind to a different case decades earlier, 1985. Cicely Saunders, the physician who essentially founded the modern hospice movement in London, documented something her nursing staff had been reporting anecdotally for years. Family members speaking gently near a patient's bed, hours from death, and a heart rate monitor ticking upward, or a hand twitching toward the sound. Saunders had no EEG data to back it with. What she had was pattern, repeated across hundreds of deaths, enough that she began training hospice staff on a rule that still holds in palliative wards today. Assume the dying can hear you until proven otherwise. Speak as if they're listening. It became doctrine before it became evidence. Here's the reframe. Call it biological asymmetry of decline. Not every system fails at the same rate, and the order isn't random. Sight goes early. Pupils stop reacting, vision narrows and blurs, sometimes hours before other signs appear. Touch and pain response dull next. Hearing, run through that ancient brainstem circuitry, appears to be the most resistant to shutdown. But resistant to shutdown isn't the same as working normally. Nobody has proven the dying brain understands words the way a healthy one does. It might just be detecting sound, the way a seashell seems to hold the ocean without knowing what an ocean is. Go back to the UBC study because there's a detail worth revisiting. Blundon's team didn't just record brainwaves once. They tested some patients repeatedly, hours apart as death approached. In most, the auditory response weakened over time, exactly what you'd expect as the brain shut down layer by layer. But in a handful of patients, the response held steady, or even sharpened slightly in the final hour. Blundon has been cautious about that detail in interviews. She won't call it evidence of heightened awareness before death, but she also hasn't explained it away. The data just sits there, an anomaly inside an anomaly. Push further into the mechanism because there's a second layer researchers are only starting to map: brainstem auditory evoked potentials, or BAEPs. These are the tiny, involuntary electrical responses your ears and brainstem produce within milliseconds of any sound, whether you're awake, asleep, sedated, or unconscious. They don't require attention. They don't require a functioning cortex. In 2009, a study out of an intensive care unit found measurable BAEPs in patients who had been declared clinically unresponsive by every standard bedside test. The response wasn't proof of awareness, but it was proof the machinery, the actual biological hardware for hearing, was still firing, sometimes for hours after the person had stopped responding to anything else in the room. Which brings the case studies together into something stranger than any single story. A hospice nurse in Oregon, interviewed for a 2016 journal article on end-of-life auditory awareness, described a routine she'd built over a 20-year career. She narrates her actions out loud to unresponsive patients. "I'm going to adjust your pillow now." Not because a chart told her to, but because early in her career, a dying patient's heart rate spiked every single time an orderly slammed a door down the hall, and settled every time her own voice returned. One nurse, one hallway, no control group. But her instinct matched Cicely Saunders' instinct, decades and continents apart, and it matched what the EEGs would eventually confirm. So what does all of this actually mean? Here's the honest answer. Scientists don't know. They're careful with that word. Hearing implies comprehension, and nobody can prove the dying brain comprehends anything. What the data shows is narrower and stranger. The biological pathway for sound processing appears to be the last one standing, sometimes by hours, in a system that is otherwise shutting down in a fairly predictable sequence. Whether there's a someone still home to receive that sound is a question no monitor can answer. Consciousness isn't a light switch neuroscience can locate and watch flicker off. It's an inference built from behavior and brain waves and best guesses, and at the edges of life, it gets blurrier than most people are comfortable admitting.
There's something almost unbearably intimate in that uncertainty. We spend our whole lives assuming other people's inner worlds are as vivid and continuous as our own, based on nothing but their words and their faces and the sounds they make back at us. At the end, when the face stops responding and the words stop coming, that assumption doesn't have anywhere to land, except in whatever the auditory system is still doing, alone, unconfirmed. And maybe that's not so different from how we read each other while alive. We are pattern recognition machines, guessing at other minds from the outside every single day, with no direct access to what's happening in there either. Death just strips the guesswork down to its most basic material: a sound, a heartbeat, and no way to ask what, if anything, was heard. Hospice workers already act on this uncertainty. They speak gently in rooms where no one is expected to answer. They play music for patients who show no sign of noticing, not because it's been proven to matter, because the cost of being wrong in that direction is nothing, and the cost of being wrong the other way is a silence no one can take back. What would you say if you knew the last thing anyone could reach you through was sound? We may already be there.